everyone, warm welcome to this workshop on cloud switching. The short title I gave it. I invited a number of speakers, and we will be starting with the commission. Ms. Laura Balken, could you please take the floor?
Sure. Can you see my screen?
Yes, very well. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you, Beth, thank you, Maria, thank you for having me. Honestly, looking at the calendar this morning, I was a bit shocked to see that it's almost May. It means that we not only have many nice long weekends coming up, but most importantly, we are really moving into the hot phase of the negotiations on the Data Act. And that's why I think that today's workshop on switching and on interoperability is very timely. And thank you very much to the BEREC colleagues for organizing it. I was asked to give a general overview of the switching and interoperability provisions in the Data Act to set the scene for the workshop today. And now I've already mentioned the negotiations, and at the risk of disappointing some of you, I won't be able to talk much about what's going on at the negotiating table, and I also won't be able to comment on the positions of the co-legislators. And I trust that you can all understand that. And with that necessary caveat, I think we can jump right in and look at how the Data Act concretely approaches switching and interoperability for data processing services. Now, from BEREC's position papers, let me see if I can. From BEREC's position papers, and past workshops and also some studies that BEREC members have done, I know that you're all very well familiar with the dynamics on the European cloud market, and I don't have to recall them too much. But we are speaking about a highly consolidated market where customers are faced with both economic and technological vendor lock-in. And the primary objective of the Data Act's provisions on cloud and on switching and on interoperability is to boost competition in this market by really breaking down those barriers to switching between providers that we see in the market today. And if you've read our proposal attentively, you'll find that we, in fact, do not use the term cloud services. We're referring to data processing services. And that's, of course, not a coincidence. It's an intentional choice to cover both cloud and edge computing and to stay open for future innovation. But of course, the lessons that we've drawn from in drafting the proposal come from the European cloud market. And one of the key lessons that we've learned from that market is that to attain a competitive and open market, switching must become free of charge, switching must become fast, and switching must become fluid. And let's look at that first aspect. Let's look at how the Data Act ensures that switching becomes free of charge. In today's cloud market, vendor lock-in or economic vendor lock-in is caused by high charges that providers pass on to the customer for switching, for leaving their services, for moving to another provider. And these charges can include data egress, so egress fees, costs for moving out of the cloud, but they can also include other things like HR costs or even charges for the use of an open interface, charges for the use of an API. And in response to these things, Article 25 of our proposal takes what we like to call a principle-based approach. And that principle is to abolish all charges related to switching from the European cloud market. And now, of course, this is not going to happen overnight. In fact, the proposal foresees a 3-year transition period. And during these first 3 years after the entry into force of the Data Act, providers are still allowed to charge reduced fees for switching. But these fees must truly reflect the costs that the provider incurs, and there will be a monitoring mechanism to ensure that these costs aren't artificially inflated. Now, during this transition period of 3 years, we expect switching to become easier and thereby also less costly for the providers. Because on the one hand, we generally expect the market to adapt to the new reality of the regulatory regime that is the Data Act. And on the other hand, we also expect that the interoperability provisions in the Data Act that will, of course, apply as of the entry into force will set much better framework conditions for switching. Now, I'll come back to that in a minute when speaking about interoperability and about how the Data Act makes switching technologically fluid. But I think it's already important to note this point, that we have this 3-year transition period, but in those 3 years, we expect the other provisions of the Data Act that apply as of the entry into force to already come into play, to already change the market towards a more interoperable market. But before we go to interoperability, I think we should also briefly look at the relevant timelines for switching, because the Data Act seeks to not only make switching really free of charge, but also fast for the customer. So it defines a maximum timeframe for the customer to notify the provider of their desire to end the contract and to switch to another provider. And once this notice period has been triggered, there's also a maximum time frame during which the switching has to happen. And on top of that, there is a minimum period for data retrieval even after the switching process has happened. But of course, there is some leeway in those timeframes, and the Data Act foresees longer periods for cases of justified technical unfeasibility, but the burden of proof for unfeasibility lies on the original provider. And I mean, I think we all know that the customer can only truly benefit from free switching and from fast switching when services are interoperable. Otherwise, they risk losing important functionalities. And now I mean that we are going to great lengths to ensure that the customer can switch free of charge. We certainly don't want them to pay in terms of reduced functionalities. And the more interoperable the services become, as I said before, the less costly it will be for service providers to enable switching. And that is why I think it won't be a surprise for many of you. Interoperability is truly at the heart of the Data Act's provisions on cloud. And I know that based on your experience with electronic communications, I certainly don't have to convince you of the merits of interoperability, but I should rather tell you how we get there in the Data Act. But before I do that, I want to briefly recall the relationship between interoperability and innovation. And I know that this is something that BEREC, in their high-level opinion on the Data Act, so in this opinion, you've really pointed out this relationship between innovation and interoperability. And I think it's important to note that the Data Act is not excessively prescriptive about how to attain interoperability. The primary objective is the result, a technologically fluid switching process. And now, how do we get there? First of all, the proposal obliges providers across the entire cloud stack to remove obstacles to switching. And an example of an obstacle could be the use of proprietary standards at the service parameter. And this provision, Article 23, the general obligation to remove obstacles applies to IaaS, it applies to PaaS, it applies to SaaS, it applies to all providers across the stack. But for providers of infrastructure as a service, the proposal goes a bit further. And in fact, it requires what we call functional equivalence. If a customer of a IaaS provider chooses to switch to another provider importantly covering the same service type, then the original provider must do everything in their power to enable this process and to ensure or facilitate functional equivalence in the use of the new provider services. So, for example, a IaaS provider that the customer wants to switch away from will have to use tools for shifting workloads, computing workloads from one virtualization technology to another virtualization technology. But of course, and importantly, this obligation on IaaS providers is limited to the services to the infrastructure under the control of the original provider. And as I said before, this obligation is limited to services of the same type. And this, I think, is widely misunderstood, but what it is intended to be is a safeguard to shield the provider from unreasonable switching requests. So, for example, a customer cannot ask to switch from a customer relationship management system to a cloud-based banking software. So this is why this limitation of the service type exists. And for yes, we know that services typically fall into rather few service types because the functionality of infrastructure as a service, basic data storage and processing, is more or less the same. Of course, there are differences, there are performance differences, there are important distinctions between different providers, but the primary functionalities of data storage and processing tend to be rather similar. But of course, if we look at platform and software as a service, that is where we see much more diversity in terms of service types. And that's why for providers of platform and software as a service, we have to look a bit further in Article 26 to see that the absolute baseline for them is to export data in a commonly used and machine-readable format. And on top of that, paragraph 2 and paragraph 3 of Article 26, they require providers to make open interfaces available. And this is where we come to interoperability, as I've said before. And here things become a bit confusing, arguably, in the proposal, because the interoperability provisions are part of Chapter 8. Many of you will have noticed that when looking at the proposal. Article 29 in Chapter 8 outlines how to ensure a common language for these interfaces that are mandated in Article 26. And Article 29 establishes what a new animal. It establishes a union repository for interoperability of data processing services. And Article 29 allows the Commission, it allows us to include both traditional standards and open interoperability specifications in this repository. Now, many of you will recall past attempts at traditional standardization for cloud. They have not resulted in significant market uptake, and it's part of the reason why we have the Data Act. And that is why, against this backdrop of our past experience in standardization for cloud, that's why we have put forward this notion of open interoperability specifications. Open interoperability specifications allow us to build on work that is being done in the market by relevant consortia of industry players, and it allows us to have an alternative route towards interoperability, building on work that industry is doing. So that is why it's important to note these parallel routes towards interoperability in Article 29. So if for a specific service type, the EU repository contains either standards or open interoperability specifications, then we ask that providers follow these standards or open interoperability specifications when implementing Article 26, so when building these open interfaces. And to be clear, we are not asking providers to align their services or to build their whole service offering in line with standards or open interoperability specifications. We want to maintain diversity in terms of service offering. We want to maintain an open route for innovation in the European cloud market. But we are asking providers to establish open interfaces and to follow a common format in doing so. So it's really this interplay between Article 26 in Chapter 6 and Article 29 in Chapter 8 that will help make interoperability, let's say, the norm on the European cloud market, and it will help to make switching more technologically fluid. And this, in turn, will also help to make switching free, fast, and a reality for customers in the European cloud market. Now, free, fast, and fluid switching will allow customers to benefit from the vast opportunities that are offered on the European cloud market already today. Providers of all sizes and shapes and forms will compete on performance. They will compete on innovation. They will compete on price, but they will no longer compete on practices of locking in their customers. And according to Eurostat, so numbers that we get fairly regularly from the colleagues at Eurostat, we know that the risk of vendor lock-in and unfair market practices are key barriers to adopting cloud for certain players in Europe. And that's why we think that a more open market with less risk for vendor lock-in, be it economic, be it technological, will further stimulate the move to the cloud. And together with easier switching, this will allow providers to really tap into a larger customer base. And if we look at some of the key additions from the co-legislators, we see that the Data Act also has the potential to further boost the attractiveness of multi-cloud strategies. In an interoperable ecosystem and in the absence of fees, for example, egress fees, customers will just have more negotiating power and more control over their cloud deployments in a more dynamic market. But really to preserve these effects, the outcome of the negotiations that we're currently in must remain ambitious. We've studied this market for a long time. We know the dynamics. We know that any loophole will further entrench lock-in practices. And also we should move quickly, both in concluding and also in implementing the regulation, all while, of course, thinking about effective enforcement. Now, to be completely honest with you, when we speak about the Data Act in front of audiences today, and we're doing this much less as the negotiations take more of our time, but typically people tend to tune out a bit at the word enforcement. But I expect it to be very different with the audience today. The proposal, as you know, it invites member states to designate one or more competent authorities as responsible for the enforcement of the Data Act. And it also gives some guidance on who these authorities should be. Concretely for Chapter 6, the proposal specifies that the national competent authority should have experience in the field of data and electronic communication services. Now, that will, of course, ring a bell for you, especially for BEREC members, and that's obviously not a coincidence. As regulators for electronic communications, you bring so much valuable experience to the table, and this experience is extremely relevant for enforcing, especially Chapter 6 and Article 29 of the Data Act. Already today with edge computing, we see a strong link to networks and electronic communications, and we expect that to become stronger in the future. And also looking towards the future, and you're the ones who know best how fundamentally the world of electronic communications is changing. And we see this change as requiring regulators to move more strongly into the digital space. And the Data Act could be a first instance of that. If you look at today's regulatory landscape for cloud, you see that it is touched by many, many different regulatory regimes. So we have cybersecurity, we have data protection, we have standardization, we have competition rules. And this is, of course, a very complex picture. And to me personally, it's also what makes cloud policy so intellectually interesting. But looking at enforcement, it poses some important challenges. There are some significant challenges for coherent enforcement in the European cloud market. And that's why in Article 31 of the proposal, we have introduced a mandatory cooperation mechanism for enforcement on Chapter 6. And this cooperation is not only across borders between the different national regulatory authorities, but also, very importantly, across regulatory disciplines. And this, we believe, is an important foundation for future, more coherent and joint approaches to enforcement in the European cloud market. But, I mean, if we come back to the present day, our immediate priority is, of course, to conclude the interinstitutional negotiations swiftly and successfully. If we do so, switching will hopefully, as I described, become free, fast, and fluid, and we are confident that the Data Act, if it's kept ambitious, will set the right baseline conditions for that. and interoperability will be at the heart of this. But I hope that I've been able to convey to you that the Data Act is not just about free, fast, and fluid switching. It's not just about interoperability. It is also about laying the basis for a more comprehensive enforcement regime with significant responsibilities, but of course also opportunities for BEREC members. And this is where we really also count on your support and cooperation on making the enforcement of the Data Act effective. And yeah, that brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you so much, and I'm really looking forward to hearing the other speakers and to the rest of the workshop.
Thank you, Laura, for this wonderful introduction into the topic and to explain what we are trying to achieve. We are organizing as BEREC this workshop on cloud switching. This is a project in the PFD working group. The co-chairs, Maria and I, are co-chairs of that working group, and we are moderating the sessions today. The host of this workshop is Scott Marcellus. He will later on introduce this to the introduction of this workshop. We have two panels with excellent speakers, and the first panel is about studies that have been performed on this topic, cloud switching, and later on we also have an industry panel that will be moderated by Maria. I'm improvising this introduction. So maybe we can start with the first presentation of Daniel Schnoor. We have a document online on the BEREC website with introduction of the speakers with a reference to their studies. So if you want, every speaker has like 10 minutes to present a teaser of their studies, and when you are interested in the rest of the study, you can find the link online. So now I would like to give the floor to Daniel Schnoor from SER. Please take the floor.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much to the organizers for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here. So I want to share with you the key findings of a report I did for the Center on Regulation in Europe. And because I only have 10 minutes, I will focus on the key recommendations. And if I have time, I will have an outlook at the end also with respect to what is coming further with respect to the role of BEREC. Let's see if we have time for that. Otherwise, I would refer you to the report where we have a more detailed analysis, where we, for example, also discuss portability versus interoperability, a point that has also been done by BEREC members. So also thank you to Laura Balke for setting the scene. That gives me the possibility to jump right in. And the main overarching recommendation of the report is really that the main focus of the Data Act should be on facilitating switching by strengthening data portability. And I will go into individual recommendations how to do that. But to elaborate, or the main rationale behind these recommendations is really that I see the Data Act as a framework of the basic rules for this industry, because it's a horizontal legislation and a symmetric regulatory framework. So I think we often think of the big firms in the market when we think of the rules and how they will apply, but we should not forget that these rules will apply to any firm that is active as a data processing service provider. And so I think it's even more important to weigh the benefits of regulation against potential adverse side effects that we may see and the regulatory burden that are introduced in this industry, which is technically very complex and is still very dynamic. So I think it's even more important to prioritize the clarity of the rule and therefore also facilitate enforceability of these rules. So this is why we think the focus should be on promoting and facilitating one-off switching between data processing services. One-off doesn't mean that you should not only switch once, but that it's really about, okay, you are using another service and you transfer your data from one to the other service provider and provide your service there. Interoperability can certainly bring value to customers, but we see it more as an additional provision that should be subject to further justification. I will elaborate on that. And then we should not forget that there are complementary tools to this basic rule. So we have competition law, but we may also see in the future sector-specific regulation as complementary tools that could also really address competition issues if they're present. Now, our key recommendation 1 is on the contractual obligations that Laura laid out. Here we agree that we should save the right to data portability by additional safeguards. So especially to specify a minimum scope of data, to have a maximum transition period, and also in principle to safeguard against inflated financial barriers to switching. We agree with these rules to the extent that they are really targeted to the switching process. On the other hand, we recommend to remove Article 23(1)(a), which gives the customer a general right to terminate any contractual agreement within 30 days. Because here we think also for smaller players, but also for customers, longer term contracts can have value if they are voluntarily agreed upon. Now, these switching charges have been a controversial issue. I think it's important to have a safeguard against an inflated barrier to switching. But then on the other hand, we see also that there should be some recoupment of regular costs. And what do I mean by regular costs? So if you have costs that are negotiated in the contract and then apply in any case, and not especially if you're switching or leaving the service, then there should be room for also recouping the costs, because you could also think of smaller providers that have a big customer that is leaving, and then you have actual costs, and you also have to think of how you can bear that burden. I think what is also taken up in the proposals by the Council and the Parliament is that switching is really a process that involves several parties. So the rule should also consider that they all do their necessary duty to successful switching. The second key recommendation is on data portability. And here we see really Article 24(1)(b) on the minimum scope of data, covering data and metadata, as well as the criteria outlined in Article 26(4) on the data format as the default portability requirement for all data processing services. So data and metadata should be exportable in a structured and commonly used and machine-readable format. And I suggest to also complement that by an additional criterion that the data is in a non-proprietary open format, because if you would have a big player, you could argue that that format used by that operator is already commonly used. But what we want is a format that can also be used by any destination service provider. Now, the third recommendation is on functional equivalence, and there has also been quite a lot of controversy on that. I see, especially with respect to the main proposals, two problems here. So functional equivalence, as it was articulated in the proposal, said that the original service provider must ensure that a customer that switches to a destination service provider of the same service type enjoys the same service with the same performance, the same quality, and so on. And there's, of course, one issue that it couldn't introduce a linkage of responsibilities. So when is the original service provider for the conduct of the destination service provider? And in my opinion, it just runs the risk of creating a lot of uncertainty and possibly then litigation, who is really responsible if the performance at the destination service provider is subpar. The other challenge is really, what is a service of the same service type? So Laura gave us some intuitions, and I think we all have these intuitions. But if it goes really into detail, the question will be, where do we draw the line? So if a data analytics service uses different algorithms, is it still the same service type? I also expect a lot of haggling going on there. So what we suggest in the report is a replacement of the functional equivalence criterion with something what we call a hypothetical service replication test. That instead of looking at a destination service provider, really looks at the original service provider. So the idea is here, hypothetically, if you would take out the portable data and your service from the original service provider, and you would come with that data as a new customer to the same service provider, could you recreate the original service without any major linking going on with internal data? And that would give you an indication whether the data you can get out is of sufficient completeness and also sufficient quality that you can create equally performance service at an as efficient provider. And it also reduces the need to classify services of the same service type. Now, the fourth recommendation is on an interoperability regulation. And there I see the value certainly of interoperability, but I'm also a little bit more skeptical in terms of how do we implement it in cloud computing markets, which of course are very diverse. So we can talk about infrastructure as a service, software as a service, and the characteristics will be different there. And I think at the moment, this is very general, and we have to think harder about what are the benefits and what are the costs of interoperability. And so we suggest to have these interoperability provisions in there, but tie them to either the ineffectiveness of data portability in specific markets or the identification of additional market failures. This is supported by two main arguments. So really the technical complexity of these markets and also the dynamic technological progress that we still see. So it will be very hard to come up with a standard that everyone agrees on and that is then further developed in coordination between all the parties that are there. The second thing is, I think of course, interoperability has pro-competitive effects, but it's not a one-way street. So if we make everything interoperable, then economies of scale, economies of scope may be even more important. So it could also be to the benefit of the bigger players. And I think we still need to think in more detail and harder about these consequences of interoperability. Now with that, I want to conclude. And I think the message I wanted to bring across is that I see value in the Data Act in bringing rules to this very important industry.
Einfach sagen, dass Sie morgen noch 39 Fieber hatten, dann müssten wir eigentlich in die Klinik gehen.
Nee, das müssen wir nicht per se.
Cool.
Gira, you have muted everybody now. Please give the floor to Daniel.
Sorry, do you hear me again now? Okay, I was starting to conclude. I think that was the last thing you heard from me. So what I wanted to bring across here, the key message is really that the DA is a symmetric regulatory framework that brings basic rules to a very important industry. And on the other hand, we should also look for the need for sector-specific regulation. And of course, we also have the DMA, where cloud computing are core platform services, which presents us with complementary instruments, and also think about potential competition issues based on an asymmetric regulatory regime. I fully agree with Laura that there will be now a lot of questions with respect to implementing these rules. And we certainly require technical expertise and facilitating institutions, because I also think that some of the hard questions have been pushed down the road to get the Data Act now through. And then this is, of course, a field where BEREC should play a very important role with all the experience in terms of switching and interoperability. But I think it's also important that we first have a thorough understanding of the economic characteristics and also the competition dynamics that go on in the cloud computing industry. And I think we have to dive deeper, because cloud computing is such a diverse term, and we need to look at more specific markets and assess the potential market failures there, but also the competition dynamics. So with that, I want to finish, and thank you again for having me, and I'm looking forward to the other presentations and the discussion.
Thank you, Daniel. And the participants, we will continue with panel 1, and we will have the introduction of words from our chair after the first panel. And the second speaker is Claude Rumport from Beltug, and if I'm correct, he has defined 11 fair principles, and maybe in cooperation with the French, German, and Dutch colleagues, if I'm correct. And would you like to tell us about it? I think you're still muted.
Okay, do you hear me now? Okay, that's great. So BELTEC is the Belgian Association of CIOs and Digital Technology Leaders. And this means that we are the business users of the digital technologies. So members are the companies that use digital technologies and the networks. And I will give you the point of view of the business users today about the Data Act. What we did, I can get the next slide, so I don't know why. So 30 years ago, Europe broke up the telecom market and the monopolies, because Europe saw the competition in the telecom market would create a lock-in, would create many opportunities. And today, the situation that we face on the cloud computing market, as Laura already explained, is a much higher lock-in in the cloud service market. What we did as Belgian organization of CIOs and digital technology leaders is really work together during 3 years with our sister organizations. In France, CIREF, in the Netherlands, CIO Platform, and in Germany, Voice. And our company members have over the years seen a lot of clauses in contracts that are unfair, that are unbalanced, and that are problems in the business. And so we work together to try to find the 11 most important things that should be correct in the contracts, and to publish fair principles about that. And these fair principles, you can find them. It's a big documentation, because we have the details, we have examples, and we have images on the problems with the fair principles. And we want really to get a balanced cloud market. First principle is that vendors shall fulfill existing regulatory obligations. And this seems perhaps for you an evidence, and it is not. Because when you see how long it takes discussions about GDPR, even with the big cloud providers, it's really a big problem. And I am really curious to see how fast the cloud providers will change their contract to comply with the new rules written in the Data Act once the Data Act will be published. Our second principle is exactly the subject of today. Vendors must not create a technical or commercial lock-in. I told you about pictures. For each principle, we have such a nice image to explain to anybody, not only IT people or communication people, what the problem is. Each provider proposes his own specific technical environment. So changing means a lot of redevelopment, and interoperability would be, of course, a kind of solution. Moreover, license management and migration costs create additional lock-in. This is exactly what Laura said, what also Daniel said. And lock-in means that there is a kind of monopoly situation, because you have chosen the market when you choose your provider, but when it is chosen with the lock-in, you are in a monopoly situation, and the provider can change the price and can change the functionalities. And well, you must just accept it. And this is, they do it, of course. Today, in the cloud services agreement, I was very surprised to check that, but less than 5% agreements include a switching and exit clause today with your members. And this means that the companies enter cloud, but they do not know, they do not have an idea how to get out of it, because you can end the contract, but do you get your data and your applications back? And then comes the cost problem, because at that time you have to take the time and the cost to get out. So this is a big obstacle. And happily, Commission, as Laura explained, understood this problem and has published very interesting articles in the Data Act. I took here 2 of them. Article 23, removing obstacles to effective switching between providers of data processing services, and Article 25, gradual withdrawal of switching charges. Laura explains this better than I could do. So, what is already clear? So, as Laura said, there is today trilogue. So, there is a version of the Data Act by the Commission in February last year, a version of the Data Act by the Parliament in March this year, and a version of the Data Act by the Council also in March this year. And so they started the discussions. So, as Laura said, it's not evident to say where we will come, but some points are already clear. What is already clear is that cloud service agreements shall include switching and exit clauses with specific terms. These terms are mentioned in the Data Act. And so the three parties agree with that, so it will come out. What is still in discussion? Well, one important point, and Daniel told about it also, the switching has a cost. It's an evidence. How to evaluate the cost and who will pay the cost? Good question. The answer of the Commission is what you have seen in the article there. And the Council says the same. The provider should evaluate cost of switching at an aggregate level. This is exactly what has happened in the regulations for telecom, switching between telecom providers, or energy, switching between energy providers, or for banking industry, switching between one bank to another. But the Parliament has introduced an amendment on that one, and it changed a little bit the rules. First point, charges linked to mandatory operations that provider must perform will be zero, so good news. But the next one is new. Charges for services undertaken at the customer request shall not be zero. So this opens the door for setting charges again for the switching, and so to get the lock-in again more efficient. So now best guess. What can we expect for implementation? So this is not the reality. This is what I think that will happen in the coming months. In all cases, switching brings a lot of worries and will never be pleasant. So you will not have switching for the pleasure of switching. And the Commission wants to make a real change in the market to restore competition. And the Commission has appointed an expert group, 20 experts, to try to write contractual clauses aligned with the Data Act. And this expert group has written a switching and exit clause compliant with the Data Act. Will that become a reality on the market? Well, this is the next explanation here. This clause will be presented as part of standard contractual clauses, and these standard contractual clauses will not be mandatory because there is freedom of contracting. But the Commission intends to include these in a cloud rulebook, and all public tenders will require the compliance with the cloud rulebook. So we can hope that this might create a new reference on the market. Still, my personal guess on what will happen. The expert group proposes that each cloud service agreement includes, from the beginning, a switching and exit plan. I mean, from the beginning, even in the marketing phase, in the commercial discussions, that the provider has to show what his plan for switching and exit for helping the customer to switch. And that this plan might be used also in competition discussion before signing an agreement, and that it has to be included in the agreement. And we also ask that the provider provides tools to export and transport the customer data. It might seem an evidence for you, but it is not. No, today the provider considers switching is a responsibility of the customer, and tools to export and transport are not common practice. What is common practice are tools to import and transport for starting the business of the customer in the cloud, but not exporting them afterwards. So what we hope as business users, as users of cloud service, that the quality of a switching and exit plan that must be discussed upfront in the contract might become an element of competition between the providers, and so that it might become a reality also on the market. Now I come back to the big picture. I started showing that 30 years ago, the telecom market the monopoly was broken and switching was asked to be possible. And my question here is a question about the role of BEREC, or the national BIPT association of companies like you, like BEREC. So what is the role? And the role will not be simple, because telecom role in BEREC is evident, but now the telcos and the cloud providers are mixing a little bit. And they are a little bit forced of mixing because of the reality on the elements. Internet of Things lead to data explosion. And so the telco cannot only transport the data, it's not enough. They need some kind of regional cloud infrastructure to serve their customers. And what we see, at least in Belgium, but also I think in other countries, is that, well, the telcos are talking with a cloud service provider to try to find solutions for their customers. And so there is still concentration in the telco business, and there are joint offerings between the telcos and the cloud service providers. So I suppose the regulators will have to tackle these kind of problems also, to have positions not only to the telco, not only to the cloud service providers, but also to the mix of them. And so also next point for BEREC, I think the Gigabit Infrastructure Act, but this has just come and it's not for the today discussion. So I hope I brought some information about the point of view of the business users, and we absolutely like the approach presented by the Commission, by Laura, about switching that must be cheap, that must be fast, and that must be fluid. And we try also to favor these orientations. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Claude. And we will take questions after the fourth speaker. Please write your questions in the chat. And now I would like to give the floor to Ilse Rotovic, who also will present her study on cloud switching.
Thank you very much, and good morning. I have a link to the presentation here. The aim of our study was really to try and figure out what is meant, or what should be meant, by cloud porting and interoperability, and how could it perhaps be implemented in practice. And from that, we tried to draw some lessons for perhaps the implications for the Data Act. And I will start with something that I hope would be very familiar to everyone in the room, and that is how interoperability and portability have applied to telecoms. I'll also briefly mention banking as well. But I think it's worth saying that, of course, telecoms interoperability has a very long history, but let's not forget what was involved and exactly how long it took to move forward. So I've provided some examples here. In 1983, work started on a European standard for mobile voice telecoms. So in 1987, it's 4 years later, we had the first GSM technical specifications. We had the first SMS being sent in 1992. We had interoperability for SMS in 1999. We then had picture messaging. We've now got rich communication services. I hope you see the story, but in each case, what we can see is that it took quite a long time to make the interoperability work. And in the meantime, okay, there was progression. So you had messaging, and we had picture messaging, we have rich communications. But if you look at what happened outside the standardized world, it went far quicker. So if you can think of, I don't know, WhatsApp, Facebook messaging services, and so on, I think there's a lesson to be learnt there. Services evolved, the standardized services evolved, but it took a long time to evolve them. And in the meantime, the features and functionality of non-standardized services rapidly overtook the standardized versions. So there was innovation outside the area of standards. If we look briefly at porting as well, porting obligations exist in both telecoms and banking, but let's look at what it covers. So in telecoms, for example, it covers the identifier, number porting. It also covers the processes for switching from one player to another. And we see in banking, that also covers the processes for switching for one player to another, and also key data, so transactions such as standing orders and so on. So what lessons can we learn from that? And that is porting and switching are very important in fostering competition, but where it's been made to work, and I haven't put timescales in here, it took a long time, where it's been made to work, it involved very basic information, really key information and key processes, it required collaboration between the recipient and the donor. So both were involved. And something else that I would say is characterized, is a characteristic of both telecoms and banking. They are both fundamental essential services. I'm sure that cloud computing will get there, but it's not quite there yet. And last but not least, telecoms and banking are services where single homing is very common. You typically only have one broadband provider or maybe one mobile phone. Most people have one key banking account. So switching really is something there that is fundamental. In cloud, there is a degree of more multi-homing involved. But let's move forward. What might interoperability and portability mean in the cloud? Well, let's start by defining it. The ability of a cloud service customer's on-premise system to interact with a cloud service, or the ability for one cloud service to interact with other cloud services by exchanging information according to a prescribed method to obtain predictable results. Let's elaborate on that. Interoperability for cloud services is really not a straightforward concept like the concept of interoperating between very similar services like voice calls, SMS, or banking accounts. It can mean many, many things. We're talking here about interoperability between the whole IT environment, which could include infrastructure, platforms, applications, and data. Try to include an illustration here. So when we talk about portability, for example, it might not only mean data portability, but also application portability. When we talk about software as a service, there are many, many different varieties of service that covers. Something else that is important to note, the responsibility for porting varies depending on the scenario. So for example, when you're looking at infrastructure as a service, the responsibility for porting most aspects there, or the effort that at least is required for porting most aspects there, lies with the customer. And that is simply because it is the customer's platform, the customer's application. It is only the infrastructure that they are renting. This varies as you go across the value chain. The effort involved in switching and the cost also varies. And I think it's worth pointing out here that if you've stayed with a single provider for a rather long time, the amount of data that's stored can run into petabytes. Now, we've tried to illustrate perhaps some of the scenarios and implications in this diagram here. I don't think that we really have time to run through it in detail, but I guess my first comment would be this. If as a customer you are...
This thing's just there now.
Sorry, I can hear somebody in the background. Yeah, if as a customer you're thinking about changing your provider, the decision you make isn't only about changing perhaps from one IaaS to another IaaS. You might decide, for example, to move from one IaaS to PaaS. There are many different permutations of the decision that you might take. If it's for IaaS, then effectively the process involves what we might call lifting and shifting. And there are certain things, of course, that the cloud service provider can and should do in order to support that. But the stack that sits on top of the IaaS is effectively the stack belonging to the customer, including the data incorporated in that. If you're talking about PaaS, you have to look at whether the platform or how similar the platform is on the other service that you are migrating to. There might be some need for refactoring, for example, which is amending the program somewhat in order to make it work. When you're moving from one SaaS to another SaaS, in effect, you're actually replacing one service with another. I'm not saying that there aren't many elements here where it is relevant to think about how to port data, how to port applications and so on. I'm trying to provide an illustration of just how many scenarios, how many permutations, and how complicated this area is. Now, are there solutions? Of course there are. For data portability, in some cases, a cloud service provider might have tools available to help. I certainly think it would be a good idea for these to be made available. There are certain standards that can help as well. There are other standards like REST, JSON, XML, and so on that can help in enabling data transmission between different applications. There have been industry initiatives to support switching, such as the SWIPO Code of Conduct. But I think it's interesting to note that even in this Code of Conduct, it is focused on switching between IaaS and potentially IaaS and on-premise, which should be the most straightforward area in which switching could occur, but it still notes that it's difficult to estimate switching costs, and there may be data portability incompatibilities due to the variety of technologies, protocols, and implementation methods involved. This is a very, very far cry away from making SMS interoperable, for example, or porting a telecoms identifier. With that, I'm going to move on briefly to some comments about the Data Act and some suggestions about perhaps how it could best be implemented. The first comment is that the Draft Data Act measures, both on switching and on interoperability, appear to go well beyond the provisions in the Digital Markets Act. And that was a surprise to me. I have a background in telecoms regulation, but normally the requirements and obligations which apply to gatekeepers or players with market power would be more detailed and perhaps more onerous than those that apply to the market as a whole. So that was a first question mark that I had when looking at the Data Act. Another point that I've made before, but it's worth making again, cloud computing includes a vast range of different kinds of services. It makes no sense to talk about interoperability and portability in a generic way. It only makes sense when you're talking about specific cloud services or data. And think back to the examples from telecoms and banking. They are extremely specific. There are provisions in the Draft Data Act which talk about seeking full equivalence in interoperability and service continuity in switching, but if you do that, that leaves very little room for service differentiation and innovation. And last but not least, as I mentioned before, the responsibilities for different aspects of the switching process may lay with different players. And I'm not suggesting that the cloud service providers should abrogate responsibility, far from it, but the remit of their responsibility depends on the type of service they are providing, and some responsibility for other aspects of the migration process would then lie with the customer, and this varies per scenario, per level, per type of the cloud service offered. And this also affects, of course, the complexity and time frame for switching, and very often it will require collaboration not only between the donor and the recipient, but also the customer as well, to make a migration work. Lastly, what would be our recommendations for the implementation of the Data Act? The first point would be really to think about cases. It makes no sense to think about generics. Think about cases, case-specific intervention rather than general obligations. And in this context, it means that instead of thinking about blanket obligations for cloud interoperability and portability and rather undefined standards goals, we should identify very specific applications and cases where there is a need, an objective interest for portability and interoperability based on evidence of demand for this type of interoperability and portability, and noting that this should not be being met by the market. In addition, when standards are mandated, it's important to ensure the relevant use case is clearly identified, to ensure that intervention is relevant to the problem identified. Again, you'll be familiar with that from telecoms law, and that the measures are proportionate and take into account the implications on innovation and the potential to differentiate. Now, there may be space to ensure functional equivalence, but the objective to ensure this should be limited to basic functions or data. which you could call a subset of mature and established functions or data which have been identified as essential. And it would be important to further clarify that concept. Beyond that definition, the market should be left free to innovate. Third recommendation really relates to migration, and I've deliberately here called it migration rather than switching, so I think that more accurately describes I guess the feel and potentially the length of the process. There is a need to distinguish between standardized and bespoke cloud services because the processes involved might be quite different in each case. There is a need to limit responsibilities for migration as far as the cloud service providers are concerned to those which are under their control. And that's not to say that they should not have those responsibilities, but please remember the diagrams before. Depending on the type of service, their responsibility will vary. There will be a need to require the recipient to collaborate in good faith. It takes more than one to achieve a migration. And lastly, I've heard a lot about problems with contractual issues. Perhaps that could be addressed by developing model contract provisions which address those issues. And last but not least, I think this is a point that was also made by the speaker from SER, it's important to avoid overlapping other measures or adding to other legislative measures. The Digital Markets Act already addresses portability and interoperability for cloud services when the cloud service provider is a gatekeeper. Normally, the Data Act should be a lighter touch measure. It's a complementary measure. It's symmetric. It applies to everyone. And it shouldn't seek to extend the Digital Markets Act. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Ilse.
Sorry, I need to stop the sharing.
Thank you. And I would like to call all the participants to write your questions in the chat. We already have one question from Katia Marcantonio from our colleagues from Agicom. I'll read it aloud. Since it seems that the scope of data export depends on the type of cloud services, what are the main differences and implications which should be taken into account when exporting data from different cloud layers? I think this question is meant for Ilse, because you mentioned that we should make a distinction between different kinds of cloud services. Can you elaborate a bit on this? Would it be useful to have some clarity on the main clusters of metadata produced by the use of main different cloud services?
I'm not a technical expert on this area, but I think one aspect that I think is important to highlight is that in some cases, especially when you're talking about IaaS, for example, the data is under the control of the customer. Effectively, they are renting infrastructure, renting equipment, and everything on top of that is their own. So there are only certain scenarios, in a sense, in which the data is very specifically the responsibility of the cloud service provider. There is definitely a need to go into, I mean, I think we went one level of complexity down from the Data Act. There's a need to do a lot more work to get even further down into it. But I think the message is clear. This is not something that can be legislated for with the stroke of the pen. If you want the Data Act to be made effective, you have to think about very specific issues, very specific problems, and address those directly.
Thank you, Ilse. I would like to give the floor to Oscar and then continue with questions. Oscar is from Telefonica and is also part of GSMA, and they have developed the Open Gateway initiative. Please tell us all about it.
Okay, thank you, Marian. Can you see my screen? Yes, okay. So before I start, let me just give a brief introduction. First of all, thank you very much for inviting Telefonica to this workshop. It is our pleasure to be here. So as you probably know, telco and network operators have evolved our networks dramatically in the last years. With the arrival of 3G, 4G, 5G standards, we have now a full set of new capabilities. However, these new capabilities are not easily available for the audience. So they are only available through complex special projects that require a lot of time and resources and that are not easily replicable for other customers. So the good thing about these new generations of network is that it is now easier for telco operators to expose these capabilities and transform our networks in programmable networks. And programmable networks means networks that are accessible by third parties by the means of simple and interoperable APIs that we put at their disposal. So now telcos have understood the potential of these programmable networks, and we want to enable a new generation of possibilities for developers and for the end user, which will be able to experience new features and new immersive technologies in the future. So the question now is, how are we going to make this happen? And the answer is Open Gateway. What is Open Gateway? Open Gateway is an initiative that is led by GSMA and in which, of course, all telco operators are participating, that looks to transform our networks, as I said before, into platforms. So one of the few networks or platforms that were not exposed for public use until now were telco networks, and this is going to change. How are we going to do this? Well, basically, we're going to open our capabilities, and this is the important thing, in an interoperable and programmable way. And we are going to do it through the surveillance of Camara, which is a project led by GSMA and the open source, and that looks to standardize all these APIs amongst all telco operators so that they are easily accessible for all developers worldwide in a very simple way. So what are the three main concepts behind Open Gateway? First of all, universal access. This means that we're going to open these APIs, which are going to be standardized, and they are going to be universal for developers. So whatever a developer needs to access an API in Deutsche Telekom network or in Telefonica network, the API will be the same, the access and the code is going to be exactly the same. We're going to open the possibility to a full new set of experiences to developers and also to the end users. And the most important thing here is to do it easy, to make it easy for the developer, because as I said before, it was very difficult for developers to access these capabilities. In many cases, it was not possible in the past, but now this is changing. So we are defining very simple APIs that are abstracting the complexity of the networks for developers. Let's say layer 1 APIs for network APIs are extremely complex. They are only understandable by experts. We're going to abstract developers from this complexity. As I said before, one integration for all telcos worldwide. So a developer that develops an application and wants to call an API, the call is going to work in the same way, whatever telco is behind that customer. The telcos also will allow developers to integrate directly with us or through the main cloud players. As you perfectly know, application developers usually run public clouds such as Google, AWS, Azure. So it will be possible to integrate with them as well. And of course, privacy and regulatory requirements are satisfied by default. This is something that is implicitly stated in the design and in the standardization that we're doing through the GSMA. So what is the status as of today? This initiative was announced at Mobile World Congress this year. By then, 21 operators have signed the MOU. Right now, this number is growing. Now we are 25 telcos, growing week after week. We have telcos all around the world in the 5 continents. As I said before, this is growing. There is a general acceptance, and this is something that is going to change our sector. So very quickly, in order for you to understand how this is working. So we're going to read this slide from right to left. So imagine we have a very large customer that has their own IT department. They can access these APIs integrating directly through the operator. That is something they can do. Or alternatively, they can integrate through an aggregator. An aggregator can be a hyperscaler or an aggregator that is, let's say, aggregating the traffic from different operators. And in this way, the large B2B customer or the developer can access the whole set of fixed and mobile telco customers worldwide. So we are making it easy for developers to access all our customers, and we are exposing all our capabilities in a simple way for them. And what is going to be the result of this? So first of all, this is changing the role And this is having an impact on all the players in this industry. So first of all, for telco companies, this is changing our role. Now we are leaders in this initiative. We are being a primary part of this initiative. We are now contributing to the evolution of the sector and of the possibilities of the telco networks. Aggregators, as I said before, hyperscalers, for instance, will be able to include many more solutions, many more features that experienced creators such as developers will be able to use when they are developing their applications or creating their services for their customers. And finally, as I said before, all this will result in an improved user experience, in new immersive, in new technologies, in new services and features that were not possible before. Use cases. Well, this is just an example, right? I mean, we're just in the discovery phase. Every day, every week, we are meeting with customers, we're meeting with developers, and we're understanding the possibilities that this new approach that Open Gateway is allowing is able to provide us. So I mean, these are just examples, as I said before, but we are seeing very interesting possibilities in the banking, I mean, and anti-fraud with more secure transactions, for instance, in the gaming and entertainment industry. We are able to fine-tune the configuration of the connectivity in order to match the requirements of the applications. Same thing for unified comms and collaborations. We are able to provide specific quality for specific services if needed. In the industry, for critical applications, we are able to guarantee that the applications are going to have the right response from the network. And for instance, also in healthcare, we are able to, this opens a huge set of possibilities for patient care remotely or for remote surgery, for instance. Once again, as I said, this is just examples. We are understanding and learning more day after day. And well, this is just a picture to show you where we are today. So we are evolving from the traditional APIs, such as voice, SMS, or best effort data that you perfectly know. We are evolving to something very different. So our networks are extremely capable. We're just discovering that this is just the top of the iceberg, discovering all the possibilities that our networks can offer to developers and to customers. And for instance, in Mobile World Congress, we announced availability in all these, in many telco operators of these 8 APIs. So for instance, to give you a quick example, device status allows a developer to understand if a customer is in roaming, or if the SIM card is active, connected to a specific network or not. You can imagine many possibilities for that. QD Mobile is able to assign specific network parameters for the traffic, such as latency or jitter, or you can have device location that allows, for instance, a company to declare a geographical range, and we are able to confirm if the customer is in that geographical range or not, of course, asking for his consent. SMS-based authentication that you perfectly know, when there is an SMS code that is sent for authentication, but there is also the possibility of doing that silently. Authenticating the customer without asking for him to input the code. SIM swap, for instance, is very interesting for banking because it gives the latest date or the latest timestamp of the time when the SIM was changed from one device to another. So it can help detecting potential fraud. And edge side and selection routing, for instance, allows the network to select the best node in order to allow the lowest latency for a specific application of the customer. So as I said before, this is just an example. We are evolving. We already have tens of additional APIs that we are analyzing. It is now our job within the GSMA to decide which ones are the ones that we're going to standardize together and launch to the market. But we have the potential to expose many, many more capabilities, and we will do it in the future. So finally, as key takeaways, as I said before, this is a new initiative. As I said before, that it takes telco operators a long time to evolve and to standardize. It is true, but this initiative is brand new. It was started last year, and it was announced in Mobile World Congress this year, and most of the telco operators are already working on it, and we are doing great progress. So it's great to see that we are collaborating to change the sector and to expose all our capabilities to the market. So, and here once again, we are looking to the developer. The developer is the one who's going to make this happen. We're going to make it very easy for the developer to access these capabilities, these APIs, So we are going to standardize the API. The developer will not have to worry about different APIs or different codes for the different networks. This is not going to happen. One single line of code, and this is our promise, will be able to open a network capability for developers. And finally, you can imagine the new set of possibilities and experience that this will bring to final customers. So we're going to see in the future a new set of applications that are going to take profit of these network capabilities and that are going to be in the benefit of the end customers. So this is it. Thank you very much for your time. I had to rush because I think we're already late on the schedule and it was a very short slot, but I'm more than willing to answer to any of your questions in the Q&A session.
Thank you, Carlos. Oscar, I was thinking, is this then completely compliant to fair principle number 2 from Delta?
Which is that principle? Sorry, I'm not a regulatory expert.
Principle 2.
And go to market.
Okay. Principle 2 is vendors should not create any technical or commercial lock-in. So this is also
Absolutely.
the idea of the Data Act.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, we are standardizing APIs. The only thing we're doing is that we are making sure that the APIs are exactly the same for all developers. But this is the only thing we're doing. Then developers will have to decide who they are purchasing their APIs from. But if we're not making it easy, it is very difficult for developers to develop on top of our networks because each network is different. So the main goal of Open Gateway is standardizing the access to these APIs.
And you're doing it for all the different network cloud services as well, because we have been talking about cloud services that are so much different from each other, and you seem to be working on all of them. Is that correct?
Well, we're working on the ones that I showed before, and these ones are fully standardized, and all the telcos that want to expose their APIs based on Open Gateway standards will have to commit to using these same APIs based on the standard. For the rest, of course, if we are not able to reach an agreement on the standardization, then of course they will not be part of Open Gateway.
So, yeah, wonderful. Thank you very much. And thank you for all the speakers for such clear presentations and all more or less within the time, and we have started a little late, so that confused me a bit with the schedule. So I would like to ask the audience to write down some questions. We have heard already very good suggestions for improvement of the Data Act and also for implementing it, and I'm sure there are more questions about it. And one question from EDT: does functional equivalence refer to services, and how easy is for the same service type attribute is going to be defined? And I also would like to change that question a bit to Daniel, who suggested service replicability test. When you move from one cloud to the other, it's not just data, but you also move outcome of intelligence, because the cloud involves intelligence as well. And I think currently the requirement is that you can switch, and the recipient cloud should offer the expected same service. So you can't expect the same outcome with different intelligence, right? So does your service replicability test include that?
Yeah, thank you. Maybe with respect to the question, probably Laura can answer it even better. What I heard from the Commission, it is that the functional equivalence applies to yes only, and please correct me, Laura, if I'm wrong, but that was what the message was. Although in the original proposal, it is a bit of confusing because the functional equivalence also appears in other paragraphs. But so my understanding and what I heard from the Commission is that it should only apply to yes. Now, to your question, I mean, the question is a little bit what you mean by intelligence. And then the question is this something that the service provider should provide, or is that something that the customer can transfer? And there's also this data portability is, I think, one end of the spectrum. The other extreme would be service portability, where you can really take the service and put it somewhere else. But then I would argue we would need even much more interoperability, also in a vertical sense, which is harder. So the benefit of our proposal is really, I think, that you don't have to make any assumption about to which service you switch. And sometimes that will also be good because, as Ilsa said, maybe you don't even want to go to the same service type, but you want to use your data and migrate it to another service and use that to some extent. So I think it's a real benefit to cut this link between the original and the destination service provider in terms of a regulatory obligation, and rather think about how can we ensure that the customer can really get out of the original service provider everything that it needs to then being able to replicate the service at another service provider. And then, of course, I think it's the duty also of the destination service provider to be as efficient and to have the capabilities to develop these capabilities to then be able to provide an equivalent service. I hope that targets your answer, your question. Otherwise, I'm happy to follow up.
Thank you. I think it's clear. We do receive more questions, but we are crazy out of time, and we also have a next panel that that needs to leave right after the workshop. Laura, you have a short remark?
Yeah, sorry, I just wanted to add very briefly a bit of clarity to what Daniel said about functional equivalence appearing also in other articles of the text. Daniel, you're fully right about what you said on Article 26 applies. Article 26.1 applies to infrastructure as a service. That's where we have the obligation. We do this proactive obligation for functional equivalence, of course, limited to what the service provider of IaaS can control. And then in Article 23, the term comes up as well, functional equivalence. So Daniel is fully right there. But here, this article, the intervention logic is a bit different. So it's about removing obstacles to the customer potentially attaining functional equivalence in the new environment. But it's not the same as the proactive obligation in Article 26.1. And yeah, if you briefly allow me to take a question from Claude in the chat, switching any contract at any time with giving the notice period. We know that there's a bit of I think this aims at the question of fixed term contracts. And I think there's been a bit of confusion about the intention of the Data Act towards fixed term contracts. I can say that the intention was not to upend this business model, which we understand has benefits for both providers in terms of security and for customers in terms of potentially reduced service fees. And we will see. I'm sure you've taken note of the text of the council on this point, and we will have to see how this is dealt with in negotiations.
Thank you for the clarification, Laura. I would like to thank all the speakers of this panel. I just talked with Maria, and we really need to move on to the next panel.
First of all, thank our panelists for joining us this morning to discuss on this relevant matter. And to set the theme, I would like to start by asking the three panelists to share their key messages about switching and interoperability of data processing services and the Data Act approach to this matter. We'll start by giving the floor to Amazon as the leading companies in the sector. So please, Arnaud, the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. Could you hear me well? Perfect. Thank you very much. First, I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to discuss the proposed Data Act today. And thank you. I also want to thank you, the other panelists and keynote speaker, for the quality of their speech. I hope that I would be as clear as them, even with my bad French accent. So let me apologize for that. So to be, I mean, as an introduction, I represent Amazon Web Services. Amazon Web Services, as you all probably know, provide innovative cloud services to various categories of customers, including, by the way, telecommunication provider. Among these services, we have today more than 200 fully featured services. We provide compute storage, networking services, analytics, machine learning, and artificial intelligence services, and security, and much more. On a pay-as-you-go pricing, this is the typical infrastructure as a service or cloud infrastructure, I would say, even broader category type of services that we provide our customer with. So overall, we support any initiative to accelerate the digitalization of companies, while we always want to ensure that our customers can choose the services that best fits with their needs, whether it is a business needs or other type of needs. So overall, in this context, and in the context of the topic of today, we always want to provide our customers with flexibility, and to provide them with a lot of different tools, whether it is AWS tools or partner tools, so they can use their application and develop their application based on this tool, but also to use particular tools that we make available to them in order to move their data in and out AWS, or to migrate their data if they want to do so to another provider. So we have a couple of services that can help our provider to do so. One example that I have in mind is a service that is called Snowball, for instance. So basically, when you have a large amount of data that you would like to switch to another provider, our customers can use these services, again, to go in or out AWS. Just for the anecdote, this is what the Ukrainian government used just before the war to migrate all the data outside of Ukraine, to make sure that all this data were able to be secured, and it was approximately 10 million of gigabytes, so which represented a lot amount of data. More generally, we have contributed on our side on a lot of initiatives with respect to portability and switching in the cloud, including what have been mentioned by a couple of keynote speakers and panelists before, the SWIPO initiative on the YASAs particularly. We contributed to the initiative, and we, among the other company, including the OVH that is part of this panel, declare services in compliance with this code. That is something, again, really important for us, because we want to provide this flexibility to our customers to move to make the decision that best fit with their needs. Overall, with respect to the Data Act, and in a very short way, we believe that all the different aspects of the Data Act with respect to portability and switching should improve in a way that it would reflect the reality, the technical and operational reality. I've heard the Commission saying that this regulation is intended to be principle-based, which is always valuable, but then divulging in the details, and it's very important to look at, let's say, the complexity of the switching process on a case-by-case basis, again, depending on what is the intention of the customer and what is the solution that the customer has developed on top of these cloud infrastructure services. I will have, let's say, two quick comments with respect to the Data Act. One is, and again, regarding the operational aspect of it, is the sort of a question mark about the delineation of responsibility between the different actor or stakeholder of the, if I would like to call it, the switching value chain. Because we believe that it's so the switching operation is a sort of a shared responsibility between the initial provider, the customer, and the destination provider. And it's important that the Data Act reflect also this sort of complexity and take into account the reason why a particular customer wants to switch and the complexity of the infrastructure, the services that the customer has built based on the cloud building blocks. So it's an important element to take into account. The second aspect is the proposal to withdraw progressively what's the text called the switching charges. That is, at least for the moment, quite broadly defined. It's important to have in mind that, as I said, customer can decide to switch for a lot of variety of reasons. And basically operate a data transfer either to switch to another provider, but also just to download the data, to make the data available to the customer, to take the data and to transfer the data as a backup. So this concept of data transfer is quite broad. And so on that, the data act should be probably a bit more precise, because otherwise the risk that we see is that this will just prevent any provider to charge any type of data transfer out fees that, as I said, can be multi-purpose. And particularly if you are a content provider, for instance, you make available a lot of data to your customer, and so you download the data. And so we generally, and a lot of providers charge a cost just for the reason that we develop innovative services, we invest in infrastructure, and we need at some points to be able to recoup that cost. So again, we need to be a bit careful about a sort of a one-size-fits-all approach with respect to this, let's say, what we call switching charges or data transfer out fee. And if I would like to give you an example, we provide, on top of the use case that I've mentioned with respect to Ukraine, another services which is basically a truck. So if you have a large amount of data that you would like to migrate, so we have a services where you have basically a truck, and behind the truck you can have a lot. You have a lot of let's say servers when you put your data to transfer the data. So for the moment we are the only one to provide this, and so if the CSP are not able to innovate and to recoup this cost of innovation, so who would be the next cloud provider to invent the next generation of this kind of truck? So this is also a sort of virtuous circle to be able to invest and innovate, and to be able to recoup cost respect to that. The last aspect respect to cost is really about, again, what I said about the delineation of responsibility. There are a lot of elements, particularly in the infrastructure side, that we don't know. I mean, we don't know what the customer is doing with the data, how he architecture its solution. And so there are a lot of elements that only the customer knows, and particularly, and I think that's Mrs. Godlovich that say that sometimes the customer may need to have external consultant, for instance, or other type of services, but we are not aware about that. Is best placed to really know and understand what it needs to switch the solution that it has developed in architecture. And the same thing on the destination provider side. He knows his own infrastructure and know what is needed to make sure that the solution that will be transferred to this destination provider would definitely work in this new environment. So again, there is also something with respect to the scoping of this type of fee that needs to be taken into consideration. This also applies to the sort of new concept about in parallel use of cloud services that was introduced in the legislative process. That's more or less the same idea. So in terms of visibility, the infrastructure cloud provider have no control on what the customer doing. So basically, we don't know whether the customer is just transferring the data or using a multi-cloud solution. We don't have visibility on this. So needs to be a little bit careful on that. And on functional equivalence, and this is my last post, we need to be careful about not oversimplifying the cloud services as they exist today. Because the oversimplification and saying that all services are equal and provide exactly the same outcome is probably a bit far from the reality. And again, you have the cloud services on the one side, but you have how they are used by customers. It could be just to develop a website or a very complex CRM solution. So ultimately, this complexity needs to be taken into account. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pablo. We are moving now to a smaller provider. but it's hard to say that you are small because you have a very global footprint. But so please, but probably you have different perspective than Amazon. So please let me give the floor to Solange from the OVH.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for this invite and for letting OVH Cloud express its position on this very key topic, the switching on the cloud market. First of all, I have to say that we fully support the initiative brought with the Data Act, and I have heard with a lot of attention Laura from the European Commission and OVH, the position of OVH Cloud is really aligned with the one of the Commission. First, OVH Cloud is promotes a fairer and fair and competitive European market on the cloud and data market. Because we are not believing, we are seeing that currently there are a lot of barriers, there are a lot of discrepancies in those markets, and we believe that the Data Act will be a building block in this field. We think too that the Data Act can bring benefits to the users, the cloud providers, and of course the consumers, because it will secure the choice of the freedom of choice from many cloud providers. With the Data Act at OVH Cloud, we really hope that the Data Act will contribute to remove all the concrete lock-in barriers we are seeing on the market. OVH Cloud is the only, it's the leader in the Europe-based cloud provider. We are the biggest cloud provider. We are the only European-based provider present in the IDC, the last IDC market space issued in November 2022. So we are present. We are offering a wide range of services on the different layers of the cloud, on the IaaS, PaaS, and in the SaaS, not directly, but through a wide ecosystem of partners. We can offer SaaS to our clients. So we have a clear view of what is happening on this market in terms of concentration between a few stakeholders. We are seeing that today in Europe, 72% of the market is in the hands of 3 cloud providers. The market share of the European providers have been divided by 2 in 5 years. So we are facing a very specific cloud market situation. That's why the Data Act is so important. That's why we believe that in the Data Act, the removal of the switching barriers is a great contribution to ensure the competition will be better in the next coming years. But not only to ensure switching between the initial provider and the second provider, but to ensure a multi-cloud approach. For example, it's something that it's key. We promote at OVH Cloud. We promote the multi-cloud approach too, because we believe that, as I'm told, we need to fit the needs of our clients. To this end, the clients must need several cloud services with corresponding to several requirements from him. So for some data, the sovereignty requirement will be very important for the client. So he will choose the cloud provider he needs for this, etc. So the choice of the client of the customer is very key on it. Regarding the removal of the barrier, what we see is that, and the European Commission explained it quite well. We have no, sorry, someone is speaking at the same time. Johan? Okay, it's okay. The removal of we have a lot of different barriers. We have commercial barriers, technical barriers, contractual barriers, and we need to fight against all of them. And I will have a word on one of the most sensitive, not the only one, one of the most sensitive, what we call the switching fees or the egress fees. At OVH Cloud, we want to abolish now what we call egress fees. That means that what we see, and you can have a look at the report released by Ofcom in the UK a few weeks ago. Ofcom is presenting quite well what they have seen on the egress fees, and they are giving some examples that are very, very interesting and are quite shocking, I would say. For example, they have calculated that to transfer the equivalent of 10 petradatas, petrobits, you will have to pay $500,000 to migrate your data. So it's egress fees. It's not only a small amount paid at the end of the contract. It's a very big barrier to prevent some customers to switch from a cloud provider to another one, and to implement a multi-cloud approach. So egress fees should be abolished now and without any exception. That means that even if we are proposing a customer to do a kind of trial, a test, offering him credit clouds, for example, no egress fees at the end. No egress fees for test, no egress fees for some kind of service. The prohibition of egress fees should reach all the cloud services. And one of the second barrier I would like to highlight, and on which OVH Cloud is fully involved to abolish its barrier too, are the technical barriers. A lot of people in this roundtable have talked about interoperability. Yes, indeed, interoperability is key. The Data Act goes in the right direction, but we consider that it could go further. And one of the and at OVH Cloud, we think that we should go. The industry and the Data Act should go to the definition of a pivot format with usable by all the stakeholders, or many pivot formats, to ensure that the data the data stored by by cloud providers could be compatible with such open formats. If I remember well, someone at the beginning of the roundtable proposed a list of some formats. The data should be compatible with such formats, and if all the cloud providers agree on this open format, it would ensure a good operability, a good portability of the data, and we believe that it's key for all the stakeholders, including and mainly the users, of course, to have it. And I know that time is running, so I will stop here because I'm not the only one to have to speak.
Thank you very much, I heard once from a cloud provider that a data center without connectivity is just a very big and expensive refrigerator. So I guess, although it's just a joke, but I guess there is also a lot of truth in it, and that telecom operators are a key player and enabler for cloud services. And as we have heard also this morning, you are also becoming users and providers of certain cloud services. So we are very interested in getting this perspective from telecommunication providers. So please, Paolo, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Maria. Thanks a lot, and thanks, BEREC, for the invitation, for inviting Athena to intervene. Indeed, as ETNO, we published some months ago a study on the Data Act that really describes the whole interest and stakes that telecom operators, European telecom operators, have in the various business areas impacted by the Data Act, be it as provider of connectivity of IoT ecosystems, providers of data analytics services to public and private customers, but also in the cloud sector. And indeed, as also explained in your concept note that you circulated with the invitation, indeed there are some telecom operators that are important cloud providers in Europe. After the kind of three main providers, we do have at kind of fifth place in the race Deutsche Telekom at European level, but the disparity is quite major, because you will see that a provider like Deutsche Telekom, for example, has 2% of the market versus over 70% combined of the three major ones. So definitely there is an ambition of telecom providers to compete in the cloud market, and you will see also other telcos in national markets that are quite important providers, KPN in the Netherlands, Orange in France, but of course there are some barriers. One is the different network effects that of course they can't leverage, but also a lot of lock-in and technical barriers that have been also explained previously also by OVH Cloud. So we actually have welcomed and worked very hard in the co-legislation process to improve the Data Act when it comes to switching and interoperability, and definitely we do think it goes in the right direction to allow cloud providers to compete on same grounds when it comes to their offerings in the European market. We would have though a couple of suggestions as a takeaway and up for debate on how to improve and further solidify the Data Act its pro-competitive objectives now that the Act is in advanced stage of negotiations. And both our suggestion goes towards more proportionality, especially for the switching obligations, taking into account the perspective of the cloud, of the telecom providers that are cloud providers, but oftentimes they are resellers of cloud resources procured from third parties, because as we say, because of all the barriers and all the technological and network effect gaps that are present in the market, oftentimes the cloud offerings of telecom providers rest on the resources and infrastructure provided by other cloud providers. So, for example, when we talk about proportionality, is also with the responsibility for the switching process. So we are talking very much about like a transferring and a receiving provider, but we would like really to have clarity on the responsibility when it comes to resellers, like oftentimes telecom providers and cloud providers vis-a-vis their customers. And we do think that it should be clear that the responsibility for the switching process should rest really on the original source of the cloud resources, so the partner of the telecom provider, because of course as reseller you may have limited access to the resources, the controls and the functions that rest with the original cloud source. And then the second suggestion we would have in terms of proportionality, again, is with the cost. We have talked a lot about egress cost, but we do think that there should be still some proportionality and remuneration for the cost of the transfer. Also because in some complex migration, complex ecosystem, some specialized companies like cloud MSPs, managed service providers, may intervene and help out the cloud, especially small cloud providers, into managing the cloud switching and transfer. So we do think there is a space for remunerating these specialized companies, MSPs, in helping out the providers managing the switching in complex migration phases. For example, take the example of a 5G private network where you do migrate the network and also migrate the cloud resources that go along with that. And then the final suggestion also, we have seen in some proposals in co-legislation cropping up some exception for some specialized cloud carve out for specific use cases. Well, we do think that there should be no place for exceptions and loopholes in the data. It should apply across the board and it should remain really technology agnostic and use case agnostic, so that the level playing field will be assured across the board. I'm happy to elaborate more in the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Paolo. Also, in this case, if you have questions from the audience, please post them in the chat so that we don't waste time when we move forward to the questions and answers slot. I will first give you maybe the possibility of all the panelists to react to the messages provided by the other speakers. Does any one of you want to take the floor?
Yeah, just one thing on interoperability, because I think it's an important topic. And there is probably two aspects of it. One was highlighted by Solange, but I think that's super important to have in mind this question of interoperability as a way also to facilitate this switching operation and always working backward from customers' needs. And there are, from my perspective, two aspects of it. One is, let's say, the sort of a development of standards that are consensus-based and based on, let's say, technical reality. That's an important factor. But if you look at the Data Act, this is, if I'm not mistaken, what the Data Act is intended to, is to promote also the development of this standard. So that's an important factor of it. The second aspect is more, let's say, if we look at the granular detail and what has been said, there are probably three at least elements that we see important with respect to interoperability. Is one, the design of the service that is built with interoperability in mind, such as, for instance, based on open source software, based on also open protocols from Kubernetes to Parquet or even HTTPS, all these kind of open protocols, and also the fact that there will be, as it has been also said at the beginning, this various set of APIs that can be made available by the provider. So this is what we do at AWS. We also provide the possibility to use our AWS SDK, so development kit, to be used outside of AWS. So this is the kind of, let's say, concrete example of how interoperability also could work in practice.
And in addition, with what I thought, not on interoperability in relation with what Arnaud just said, I think the egress fees, I would like to highlight that currently in the Data Act, we have a time frame for the abolition of the egress fees. This time frame is 3 years, starting enforcement of the Data Act. So it brings us to, we will say 2027, because we are currently in mid-2023, the time the Data Act will be adopted, etc., etc. So we are talking about postponing the abolition of egress fees in 3 years, 2027. As I told, the market goes very fast with a huge concentration of the market in some hands. We cannot wait until 2027. And to be clear, I think that the Data Act should be more ambitious on it and immediately abolish those fees, because there is no reason at all to maintain those fees during 3 years. So I think that is important to highlight. It's a change we expect from the legislators on the Data Act, is to turn the abolition immediate and not only in 3 years.
Maybe from my side, an additional consideration, because I spoke a lot about the position of telcos as providers, reseller of cloud, but also an important element, an important actual stake for telecoms is also the transformational role the cloud and the application of cloud into the transformation of networks. And we have heard previously from the speaker of Telefonica a lot about Open Gateway and also its potential to transform telecoms and network as a service, and this is very much like a gradual approach. I mean, we see this will be like the networks of tomorrow. When we see the networks of today, there is already a traditional shift of functions, components in the networks towards the cloud. So like an increasing shift of some functions, be them like firewall, data workload balances, etc. That from and have them handled from at the device level or software level to having them handled at the cloud level, for example through SaaS, where you on demand you can access that specific function via the cloud. And so there is already a transition, a cloudification of the network. Take for example about Open RAN, also new architectures for the radio access networks, and then the perspective in the long term is to having the networks become networks as a service. So the Data Act, not only as a provider perspective, but also as a customer's perspective and system integrator perspective, is extremely important, because we need to avoid, as the telecom networks evolve, new lock-in situations. But at the same time, because cloud providers are becoming increasingly evolved into telecom networks to create a balanced and stable environment also for partnerships. For example, I talked a lot about proportionality, but also, for example, in terms of a kind of switching timeline, a possibility, for example, for the cloud provider and the business customer to negotiate longer switching timeline according to the complexity of the migration process would be helpful. So definitely that's what we encourage to keep in mind, the increasingly complexity of the cloud environment applied in the telecom networks.
Thank you, Paulo. I think we are ready to take some questions from the audience, because we are running a lot of time. We have one that has been from Thomas and has been kindly answered by Claude. And we have another one from Olga. She's asking you, the speakers, what are your views on the provisions in the Data Act regarding notice periods and fixed contracts? Who wants to start?
Happy to, unless Solange, you would like to start. I mean, I concur with what Paolo just said about that. I mean, it's a question of coming back also to technical reality. Some switching operation would be or can be straightforward. Other are probably more complex, depending on the amount of data, how, again, the solution has been designed by the customer, the different, let's say, tool that the customer used. And so there should be a sort of a margin for contractual negotiation on this, which is, again, necessary, because you cannot switch let's say, all type of workloads just within a very short period of time. It is feasible for some solution. For other solution, it is not. I mean, if I would like to make a comparison or an analogy, it's not significantly different from the old traditional outsourcing world, where you had this very big period of transition between two providers. I'm not saying that it's the same because the technology is able also to fasten a little bit this process, but with a certain proportionality and limit as well. So flexibility, contractual flexibility remains important in this topic.
Yes, I agree. I would like to remind that I think it's Claude that highlighted that only 5% of the contracts contains provision about exit and switching. Of course, the complexity moving to cloud is complex. Moving out of the cloud is complex. Moving from cloud to cloud is complex too. So it's always we are talking about long and complex projects every time. We just need to make sure that this complexity, this inherent complexity, will not be made more complex with difficulties in terms of operability and portability and no presence and no adapted clause in the contract. So yes, it's the project is complex and it probably the migration lasts a couple of months at a minimum, but we can turn it easier than today.
Yeah, if I can, what we are asking is that the exit clause will be discussed upfront in the contract. So when you start a contract, you know the way it could be possible to get out. If that is clear that you have to pay $500,000 to get your data back, will you start? So the egress fee, if there are some egress fee remaining, at least they should be clear from the day one. And what we hope is to force all providers to give exit clause plan in the commercial phase, in the marketing phase, so that this can be used to compare the different offers.
I fully agree, Claude, and you're right. I would add that first, the fees should be transparent and reasonable with a at-cost approach, to be clear. And I would add that when you move to a cloud provider, this cloud provider must have in mind that one day you can move out of its servers. So for us, we consider that the price of the cloud services must include the fact that the client one day will go out of the servers of its cloud provider. So even it not necessary probably to have some kind of specific provisions on the exit fees, but if the fees are already included in the fees paid for the cloud services, the exit fees could disappear.
Yes, and at the same time, I would mention that it is not every customer that has to pay for his own getting out, because there will be only, let's say, 5%, 3%, 4%, 5% customer leaving. People will not be leaving for the pleasure of leaving. They will switch if there is a big problem. And so that's why it's written on my slide that it should be evaluated by the providers, but at an aggregate level. So they will aggregate and say, okay, if I have 5% people who are leaving, then I provision in my global costs and in my global prices for the customers this kind of amount. And then as a provider can take the cost for himself, because it makes it at an aggregate level, like the telecom did it, like the banks did it. That's the way we think is the right one.
Thank you so much. And I had the impression that we really had not enough time to really discuss all the topics and the complexities that the switching and interoperability of data processing services entice. So You have given us a lot of food for thought, and I'm sure that we will have opportunities in the future to continue talking about it and discussing how these data act provisions will be implemented. We have already here Annemarie Sipkes, she's the Vice President of BEREC, and she will close the event with her final remarks. So please, Annemarie, jump in.
Thank you, Maria. And it was really a pleasure to attend this workshop that has been so excellently organized by the co-chairs of our planning and future trends. So thank you very much for your work, the two of you in Madrid, and also the technical support. Let me just briefly what I learned, my takeaways for today. I think Laura from the European Commission had a very clear presentation. I think all of us now realize the importance of free, fast and fluid switching. Those are three that we will not forget. I appreciated really the way that Daniel and Ilsa from academia, from research, pointed out various difficulties and complexities. Do not think it is easy to get there. Switching is one thing, interoperability is something different. And although there is an analogy with what we have been doing in telecoms for some time, this does not mean that we can apply these lessons 100%. And also thank you very much, Claude and Oscar, for in the first part also presenting industry perspectives on how what you think would be a viable working business models, as well as introducing the ones that have been developed by the GSMA. And then the second, the panel we just had, I think we had a very good discussion on the various tendencies and questions, and also developments and trends that market participants, both two cloud providers with Arnaud and Solange, as well as Paolo is mentioned on the connectivity side. As a telecom regulator, I do think that we see there's a very complex interaction between telco providers on the one hand and the cloud providers, especially the hyperscalers on the other. As Maria already mentioned, there is of course dependency, because without connectivity, a data center is just a large refrigerator. On the other hand, there are very good examples of cooperation, but telcos are also client themselves more and more as they virtualize their telecom network. So in that respect, I think there's every reason for us as BEREC to understand these developments better than we have so far. So what do I take away? I think I've heard so much that I feel still very much confused, but at a significantly higher level. A higher level in that I have learned on a lot of different perspectives, as I said, from academia, from market participants, as well as from policymakers, on how they see, I think, all the principles that we hold dear and that we work on. We believe in technology neutral, a view to the future, an incentive to innovation, and to keep, as we at BEREC say, open and sustainable digital markets. But although that is a very clear strategic orientation, getting there, making this happen on the ground is going to be very difficult, and is going to, and still confronts us with a lot of technical dilemmas, questions. And I do look forward to continuing this debate. And I do want to thank all of you for participating in this debate today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Annemarie, and thank you all the speakers and participants. We will publish the recordings later on, and we will also make a full report that will be available through the BEREC website. And have a very nice day and a good weekend.